Something is shifting in this war right now, and most people watching from the comfort of their living rooms have no idea how deep the shift actually runs. This is not about territory on a map. This is not about the daily casualty numbers that scroll across your screen before you move on to the next thing. So this is about a fundamental restructuring of how modern war is being fought, who is winning that restructuring, and what it means for every one of us, because the decisions being made in the fields of eastern Ukraine right now are going to echo through global power structures for decades to come. And I think it's worth slowing down, taking a breath, and actually looking at what is happening, not through the lens of propaganda, not through the filter of whichever side you happen to sympathize with, but through the cold, hard arithmetic of battlefield reality. Because the arithmetic right now is telling a story that neither side's cheerleaders fully want to admit. Ukraine has unleashed a tactic, assistance, ways an your sure a system really well, your show as and Susunwal that is bleeding Russia in ways that the Kremlin did not plan for and is struggling to counter. And the losses, both in human lives and in economic fuel, are mounting at a pace that should make every serious observer stop and pay very close attention. Let's begin with the numbers, because the numbers are where honesty lives. In March of 2026 alone, Russia lost 35,351 troops killed or wounded, a new monthly record and a 29% increase over February. Read that again. 35,351 human beings killed or put out of the fight in a single month. That averages out to over 1,100 Russian soldiers every single day. And here is the part that the Kremlin would very much prefer you not think too hard about. Drones caused 96% of those casualties, with artillery and small arms accounting for the rest. We are not talking about epic tank battles or massive infantry assaults driving these numbers. We are talking about relatively cheap, mass-produced unmanned machines that Ukraine is now fielding at a scale and with a sophistication that has genuinely caught Russia off guard. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment, because what it means is that Ukraine has found a way to kill at industrial scale while dramatically reducing its own exposure. According to Finland's President Alexander Stubb, the current kill ratio stands at 1 Ukrainian soldier for every 5 Russian soldiers lost, with Russian forces being killed at approximately 150 to 157 soldiers per square kilometer of territory captured. That is not a small statistical footnote. That is a strategic pivot point. For years, the conventional wisdom was that Russia could simply absorb losses that would break any Western army, that the sheer mass of Russian manpower would eventually grind Ukraine down. And that assumption made a certain kind of sense when you were thinking about 2 armies fighting in the traditional way, but Ukraine changed the equation. They took the drone, which many militaries still think of as a surveillance or precision strike tool, and they turned it into the primary engine of battlefield attrition. And the results are, by any honest measure, extraordinary. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky reported that Ukrainian forces struck 151,200 in Israel and 1,207 targets in March using drones alone, a 50% increase over February. Think about that operational tempo for a second. 150,000 targets in 1 month. That is not a drone program. That is a drone industry operating at wartime scale, and it is producing results that are measurable, documented, and verified. The Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov stated plainly, these are clearly confirmed losses. We have video footage of each such strike in our system. So this is not propaganda. This is accountable, recorded battlefield data, and it points to something very significant about where the momentum in this war actually sits right now. But here is where it gets even more interesting, and this is the part that I think is genuinely underappreciated in most Western commentary. Ukraine's drone campaign has evolved far beyond the front line. In March 2020, Ukraine carried out more drone strikes than Russia did, the first time this had happened at any point in the entire war. Ukraine flew drones over 1,500 kilometers to hit oil refineries and military facilities deep inside Russian territory. And simultaneously, Ukrainian interceptor drones shot down 33,000 enemy drones in March alone. We stole in twice as many as the previous month. So you have, in the same calendar month, Ukraine outstripping Russia in offensive drone strikes while also doubling its defensive drone intercept rate. That is not a coincidence. That is the product of a systematic, deliberate industrial and doctrinal investment that has been building for years and is now producing compound returns on the battlefield. And then there is the robots. because this is where history is genuinely being made, even if most people have not registered it yet. On April 13, 20,000 cheers, I anin editor win ani see and by being sauce in one sound insects. Ukraine's Arms Makers Day, President Zelensky confirmed what defense analysts had been tracking for months. Ukrainian forces successfully captured a Russian-held position using only unmanned platforms, ground robots, and drones, without a single soldier's boot physically on the assault. That is a historical first. A military position taken, held, with prisoners captured, and empowered, and not one Ukrainian soldier in the attack corridor. 2 Russian soldiers held up a cardboard sign reading "We want to surrender" in Russian, and there were no human captors in sight. They were submitting to Ukrainian land robots and drones controlled by a pilot miles away from the front line. Base Awad CE and through. The commander of that unit said simply, "Sure, the position was taken without a single shot being fired. So you have to understand what that means at the conceptual level. It means Ukraine has found a way to take ground without bleeding. That changes the calculus of attrition in ways that are not yet fully captured in the daily casualty reports." Defense analysts are already calling this the drone wall doctrine, a system where robotic systems handle attrition and seizure while human soldiers are reserved for consolidation and holding territory. And the number of Ukrainian military units deploying ground robots grew from 67 in November 2025 to 167 by spring 2026. That is not a pilot program. That is a doctrinal rollout. Ukraine is industrializing robot warfare in real time on an active battlefield under fire, and it is working. Ukraine's President Zelensky said drones and robots had conducted more than 22,000 missions in the past 3 months alone, stating lives were saved more than 22,000 times when a robot went into the most dangerous areas instead of a warrior. Now think about that from the perspective of a country fighting a much larger opponent. Every soldier's life you save is a soldier who can fight tomorrow, next month, next year. Every position you take with a machine is a position that didn't cost you a human being. Over time, that math matters enormously. Now let's talk about the other front, the the economic front, because this is where Ukraine's strategy becomes truly sophisticated and where I think most analysts are still not connecting the dots fully. Ukraine intensified a long-range strike campaign against Russian port and energy infrastructure starting in late March in a calculated bid to prevent Russia from offloading oil onto tankers and to counteract the suspension of US sanctions on Russian oil. And the results have been staggering. Strikes on the Ust-Luga and Primorsk oil export terminals in the Baltic Sea severed as much as 40% of Russian oil export revenue, equivalent to 2 million barrels of oil a day, according to Reuters, which called it the most severe oil supply disruption in the modern history of Russia, the world's second largest oil exporter. Zelensky stated in a video address on April 19th that Russia's oil revenue losses from Ukrainian long-range capabilities were estimated at no less than $2.3 billion in March alone, in just 1 month. And oil industry sources estimated that in April, Russia was forced to reduce oil production by roughly 300,000 to 400,000 barrels per day from first quarter levels, the sharpest monthly drop in about 6 years. Now, why does this matter so deeply? Because Russia's oil revenue is not just an economic metric, it is the lifeblood of the war machine. Crude oil and refined product sales are Russia's main source of externally generated income and largely fund its war efforts. When Ukraine hits a refinery or a Baltic export terminal, it is not just making smoke and headlines. It is directly cutting the Kremlin's capacity to pay for the next wave of missiles, the next shipment of shells, the next mobilization bonus for recruits. And here is the geopolitical wrinkle that most people are missing entirely. The Middle East erupted. The Strait of Hormuz situation caused global oil prices to spike above $100 a barrel. On paper, that should have been a windfall for Moscow, and briefly it was. During the first 2 months of 2022, Russian oil and gas revenues had already plummeted by 47% due to sanctions pressure and defense spending. The outbreak of the Iran conflict abruptly reversed that trend, sparking a spike in oil prices and temporary US sanctions relaxation on Russian energy exports. Many analysts were writing headlines about Putin being the unintended beneficiary of Middle East chaos, but Ukraine read that situation and acted. Rather than sitting back and watching Russia refill its war chest from spiking oil prices, Kyiv accelerated its strike campaign against the very infrastructure Russia needed to actually export that oil. So the price went up, but the volume went down dramatically. What? Because the ports were burning. Swedish military intelligence chief Thomas Nilsson told the Financial Times that Russia would need oil to remain above $100 a barrel for the rest of the year simply to address its budget deficit. and that is before accounting for the export disruptions Ukraine is engineering. The economic squeeze is real, it is deepening, and it is not going to reverse easily. The two apps refinery, IE, Sapper, or I and B, we the key is about like one of Russia's key Black Sea export hubs, what says these hours, was struck again on April 20th, with the storage tank area catching fire, and the facility had already been struck less than a week earlier on April 16th, when a fire burned for 3 days before being extinguished. Ukraine is not just hitting these facilities once. It is hitting them repeatedly, deliberately timing strikes to undermine repair efforts and maximize cumulative damage. So we facilities. That is not opportunistic. That is systematic. That is strategy. Now, let's be honest about the picture from Russia's side, because this is where I think the analysis gets genuinely important. According to a February 2026 estimate by the Netherlands Military Intelligence and Security Service, Russia has suffered 1.2 million permanent losses, including more than 500,000 dead. 500,000 dead. In a war that started in February 2022, and the pace is not slowing in Elias and Easter and Eskensanadane, it is accelerating. The territory Russia is capturing for its mounting losses is also in long-term decline. Russian forces captured an average of 5.5 square kilometers a day in early 2026, compared to 10.66 per day in mid-2025 and 14.9 per day at the end of 2024. Russia is paying more and getting less. That is the trajectory. That is the direction the arrow is pointing. Russia is now feeding mobilized conscripts, less trained, less motivated, less likely to survive into frontline formations because the recruitment pipeline can't keep pace with the body count. The Kremlin is building what one analyst called paper divisions, new formation numbers built on the bones of depleted brigades. The 155th Brigade becomes the 55th Division. The 336th becomes the 120th. The names change. The numbers don't actually add up. According to Ukraine's I Want to Live initiative, Russia recruited only 940 troops per day in the first quarter of 2026 against a target of 1,120 per day, putting Russian recruitment on track for a 65,000-man shortfall this year, and Ukraine's explicit strategy is to exploit exactly that gap. Ukraine's major goal for 2026 is to drive Russian losses up to 50,000 troops per month. A concrete calculation, Moscow is keeping recruit inflow at 30,000 to 40,000 per month. A steadily deteriorating replenishment curve would eventually leave Russia without enough troops to sustain a front line stretching more than 1,000 kilometers. That is not an abstract theory, that is arithmetic. And the arithmetic is not moving in Moscow's favor. What Ukraine has engineered and this is worth saying clearly, so is a multi-domain attrition strategy that attacks Russia simultaneously on the battlefield, in the air, at its oil infrastructure, at its export revenue, and at its manpower reserves. Each of these pressures compounds the others. Soldiers killed at the front cannot be replaced fast enough. Oil revenue lost to drone strikes cannot fund the weapons needed to suppress Ukrainian drones. Air defense systems destroyed in long-range strikes open corridors for deeper drone penetration. Ukrainian strikes on logistics, warehouses, command posts, and oil depots 30 to 120 kilometers into the Russian rear have been particularly effective in hampering Russian assaults, according to Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi, one of Ukraine's top operational priorities. The bigger picture here, the one that should concern anyone who thinks seriously about geopolitics and global power structures, is that what is happening in Ukraine right now is not just a bilateral war between two neighbors. It is a live laboratory for 21st century warfare, and the lessons being written there are being absorbed by every serious military on the planet. Gulf states are already rushing to buy Ukrainian drone expertise, with 10-year defense cooperation agreements signed with Saudi Arabia and Qatar in March 2026. NATO is watching. China is watching. Everyone with a military and a strategic planning department is watching, because what Ukraine has demonstrated is that a smaller, less numerous force can systematically bleed a larger conventional power if it has the right technology, the right doctrine, and the right industrial base behind it. And here is the moral dimension that I think deserves more serious engagement. There are people on both sides of this debate who want to reduce it to a simple story. I and E and E and D and B, or I and D and E, Ukraine as the innocent victim, or Russia as the justified defender of its interests, or the West as the noble protector, or the West as the cynical arms dealer. And there is a little bit of each of those stories in the reality, which is why none of them fully satisfies. What I think is genuinely true, and what the data supports, is that Ukraine has made a strategic choice, a brutal one, a costly one, but a coherent one, to impose costs on Russia that Russia did not budget for and cannot easily absorb. That choice is being executed with a level of tactical sophistication and industrial efficiency that most observers did not expect from a country that was widely written off in the first weeks of the full-scale invasion back in 2022. Sweden's military intelligence chief has said that Russia would need oil above $100 a barrel just to cover its budget deficit, and simultaneously, Russia is losing soldiers at record rates, losing refinery capacity, losing export volume, and losing the one thing that autocratic states most struggle to replace, the legitimacy that comes from appearing invincible. Because when mobilized soldiers show up at a front and find themselves fighting machines that cost a few $1,000s, piloted from 20 miles away with no enemy soldier in sight to even aim at, then and that changes things psychologically at a level that no amount of state propaganda can fully suppress. The question that hangs over all of this is not whether Ukraine's strategy is working. See in the case, and the evidence says it is, at least in the operational sense. The deeper question is whether it is working fast enough and at a pace that the international architecture of support can sustain. And that is a question that doesn't have a clean answer yet. But the direction of travel is clear, the tactics are documented, and the losses on the Russian side are real.